rose from the dead, conquering King, our Prince of Peace, drawing us near. Jesus our hope, living for all who will receive. Lord, we believe.
Well, I couldn't believe who I was talking to that day. It was Robert Coleman. Coleman is the author of one of the most useful books I've ever read. It's called The Master Plan of Evangelism. It's sold millions of copies. It's still in print today, more than 50 years after he wrote it. And Robert Coleman, was sitting at my table, across the table, in Oradea, Romania. As many of you know, we spent a year there. Coleman's book popped into my mind, and Robert Coleman's life, especially beyond the book, popped into my mind as I was thinking today, or this last few days, about today and this missions emphasis that we're experiencing. His book is called The Master Plan of Evangelism, but maybe a better title is called The Master Plan of Discipleship. He actually wrote a book with that title too, and I don't know what that one would better be called. But this book with evangelism in the title is mostly about discipleship. And these readings that we've read from Mark are about Jesus calling disciples. And we've been thinking, as we've gone along today, about the role that Christian leaders have as they make disciples, as they encourage people to trust in Jesus and then to follow him. Really part of the same large process. We're keen as a church to reach out to others in our city. We want to introduce them to Christ and welcome them to the church. We do that through Alpha and Urban Ministry and Kids Zone and Youth Group and all the rest. We're also keen to reach out to others around the world. We want people everywhere to know. And so we're involved through Canadian Baptist Ministries in particular, with the Carters in Prague, the Kennys in Africa, and others as well. And all of that reminded me of Coleman's book, because he, in the Master Plan of Evangelism, explains how Jesus had a strategy for meeting people's needs, for introducing them to the kingdom of God, for telling them about what the Lord had in mind for them, and inviting them to be part of that. It's all about Jesus and his plan for saving the world. And among other things, Coleman says that there never was a distinction in his mind between home and foreign missions. As I was talking to a few people this week about this service and what I had planned, one of the things they brought up with me was, so how are you going to sort out who's a missionary and who's not? Do you have to go a certain length of distance? Like, is Krakow, Poland far enough? Is Bayside Camp far enough? Or do you have to go to Malagash to really be a mission? Well, I'm not going to get into camp versus camp competition for sure. But does it have to do with whether you're financially supportive of your own work or not? Does it have to do with whether you have need to ask others to help? I think all of those things are not true. It has to do with a desire to serve Jesus in the context where you are and in the context where you're going. All of us are on mission for Jesus Christ and his kingdom. And whether it's around your kitchen table as you talk with somebody who's just dropped in for coffee, or whether it's halfway around the world, to Jesus, it was all the same. It was all world evangelism. It was all telling another person about Jesus Christ and welcoming them into that fellowship and encouraging them to know Christ better. And how should we do that? I ask Robert Coleman in his book. Well, Coleman says, here's the way Jesus did it, which perhaps should be the way that you and I do it as well. Now, immediately you can see problems with that. I mean, no sand in our future, I don't think, at least unless it's beach sand. no deserts. The contexts are very different, and we're not going to be really specific about that. We don't want to say that everything Jesus did was the way that we ought to do it, but we can learn principles that would help us. We can look at the Master's plan and understand things about the master plan of evangelism and discipleship. One of the things that Coleman says most usefully, I think, is something that I can summarize in 2 sentences and want to elaborate on as we go along. Although Jesus had time for big crowds, that wasn't where he put most of his effort. Instead, he devoted himself to a small group of people who in turn could influence others. That's what we see over and over in the Gospels. That's what we see in the verses in Mark's Gospel that I've printed on the front of your bulletin today. A large crowd came to Jesus, and he began to teach them. And over we hear about that, as that crowds gathered on the shore of the lake, so many that he was pressed into the water and decided to set up his pulpit on a boat. Crowds came to him and exhausted every bit of energy that he had left, that the only thing that he could do after that was head to the hills to be restored, in prayer especially. And over we discover that Jesus had time for the crowds, and he cast the word out to thousands of people at a time sometimes. He began to teach them, even though he couldn't say, this is what is true in your situation just now. He could say, this is what is true in our situation, in everyone's situation. But then in the very next sentence in Mark chapter 2, we're told that as Jesus walked along, he saw Levi. Follow me, Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. And was incorporated, as we read on in the story, Levi, Matthew, was incorporated into a smaller group, a choice group of followers called the disciples. In fact, we actually don't know. Jesus had varying, stretching definitions of who the choice group was. Sometimes he's focusing on 3 people, Peter, James, and John. Sometimes he's focusing on the 12. Sometimes he's focusing on a slightly larger group. He sends out 70 at one point, 2 by 2. And we know that these people, men and women, followed him through the places that he went to, that women supported him financially, we hear one time. That men and women together were part of a small group circle for Jesus. And so these 2 things, and he had time to spend detailed time with them, to explain to them what they didn't understand, to have that kind of question and answer period that you can't do very effectively with 5,000 people who are thinking, well, we've had the bread and fish and now we need to go home for the night. But when he was with the disciples, that's a quotation from the scriptures, the Gospels, several times. When he was with the disciples, he explained everything to them. Explained the details. He went into it in greater depth. He went on to help them understand the things they particularly needed to know. And this was a continuing process. Christ calls a few disciples, he trains them well, and then he sends them out. And they, in turn, he knew, would influence their circle, give them the knowledge they needed, and the understanding and the relationships that were required, and then send them out in turn. And then they would return and process what they had experienced and explain what they had done, their failures and their successes, and leaders would go over with disciples the things that would make better leaders of them in the future. Jesus knew that one person could not possibly care for thousands of people. That's why some people just shake their heads when they see crowds of people on a television screen listening to one particular preacher? How can they relate within such a situation? And it turns out that the large megachurches manage to make discipleship work because of small groups, because of the opportunity that they invite every person who's attending into to take part in a small fellowship, learning, discipleship group. Jesus knew that one person couldn't possibly care for thousands, but his long-term plan was to save the whole world, to save crowds and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. But he knew that in order to do that, these people, in order for them to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth, that yes, his sacrificial death would cover every sin, but they needed to be invited one by one by one. They needed to be included in a small group that would encourage and disciple them. And so Jesus called one person at a time, gathered a small group to be his disciples, and then sent them out to repeat the process. Call, teach, send, repeat. Call, teach, send, repeat. And of course, that's inspired people over the centuries to do exactly that. That's why our CBM partner in mission, Daryl Buston, devotes himself to a classroom of students in Rwanda. And why Laura Lee Buston takes such good care in organizing short-term missions for people who come over to be part of that. It's why Abby and Andrea and Ben and Chris will pray for and counsel their campers this summer at Malagash and Bayside. It's why Sarah Boyd is planning for next year at Dal InterVarsity. And why Graham will learn how to be a wise representative of Jesus in Israel. And why Susanna has chosen to teach English in Krakow. Each of them are going to have opportunities, probably not to rock the whole world. Probably not to speak to thousands of people at a time, although once in a while those opportunities come up in the most unusual ways. But there is a big opportunity to influence one 11-year-old and one teenager and one kid who's new at camp and thinking his mom should come and pick him up. There's an opportunity to make a difference, one person at a time, and to gather them together in supportive little communities that can help them and encourage them. Now, I'm wondering, perhaps, what your questions are about this. Are you thinking, I don't know about this. I've never thought about my life in those terms, in terms of the time that I have for individuals, small groups, and big crowds. Perhaps some of you are thinking, for one thing, I could never do the big crowd thing. Well, I think that is a relative problem, that your big crowd and my big crowd might be a little bit different. Our big crowd and Robert Coleman's big crowd might be a bit different. Well, they are for sure. But there's probably a crowd that scares you, even if it's just 15 or 20 people. Oh, I could never read scripture at church, somebody says. Or I could never talk about my witness to more than just whoever's across the table from me. And maybe God is challenging you to be more courageous before the crowds, to spend more time with the group that scares you, with that larger opportunity to say something at work to a bigger group than you're familiar with, or to be part of an organization where someone sees promise in you and wants you to progress to a higher and larger responsibility maybe. And you say, no, I could never do that. And you just think about the list of things. Maybe God is calling us to be more courageous, to be like Jesus, who was willing to talk to the crowds. Robert Coleman actually had a problem with the small group part of this, even though he's the expert in small groups. One of the people who was part of a small group that he led told me that Coleman almost despaired once of making it work in his case. That he didn't see how he could, yes, he could teach classes. Yes, he could do that. But those classes had hundreds of people in them. And yes, he could be the dean of the School of Evangelism for the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. He did that for years. And he was used to being in this group of 1,000 people at the Metro Center, for example, or the Convention Center, I think was where I saw him briefly. And he was used to talking to those crowds. But how could he ever do a small group, he thought. And then he came up with a way to do this. He was teaching at the time at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago, one of the largest and leading evangelical seminaries in the world. And he decided that he would have a small group that he would disciple and that he would invite people to attend. He didn't hand-pick them. He just thought, I'll just put it out there. But somebody said, probably his wife, hundreds of people will come from the student body just to be with you every week. It'll be impossible. Well, he said, what if I held it at 6 o'clock in the morning on Mondays? Yes, I admit it's kind of a delicious, awful thing. But it worked. And sure enough, 10 to 15 people came every Monday morning at 6 o'clock. And they grew together, and they grew closer to Christ as Robert Coleman discipled them. You are probably thinking about other problems too, or other implications of this. One of them that I see all the time is that it's often not very productive to ask a crowd to help. Instead, it's much better to ask one or a small group of people to help. Time and time again, I've made this mistake myself. I stand in front of a big congregation and I say, I've got this great plan, and why don't you come along with me? And I need 5 people to do this, 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 and this, and this. And not one person says anything. And 3 weeks later, I'm almost ready to give up the project, and I say to somebody, I was hoping that somebody would say yes to this. And they say to me, well, you didn't ask me. And so I ask them, and they say, well, yeah, I'd like to do that. And I said, I didn't even know you wanted to do it. And I'll say to somebody else, and you, would you like to be part of that? And they say, well, sure. And I say, didn't you hear me in church 3 weeks ago? And they said, what? And I recommend this about billets, by the way, Jason. That's the first 10 people he talks to as he goes out the door today. You're the billet, all right? It's important to one-on-one ask people to be part of what God is doing, and then to gather them into a group where they can help. I think part of the advice that Coleman's giving here, and as he looks at Jesus' practice and master plan of evangelism and discipleship, one of the things that he's encouraging us to remember is that we need to not spread ourselves too thin. Yes, it's important for us, and it's possible for us to know quite a few people and to be involved in their lives. But there's sometimes a point of diminishing returns, at least, maybe even a point of no returns, when we spend so much time with this one and that one and the other one, and we don't have enough time to spend with these few. We need to devote ourselves, I think, as Jesus devoted himself to those disciples, to understand better, to understand them better, to know them well enough to make a significant difference in their life. I think of people who have done that for me over the years. And I'm so glad that from the beginning they were willing to invest time in my life. I had a supervisor for my internship year out in Lethbridge, Alberta. His name was Blake Anderson. I've mentioned him to you once before, I think. And he's the guy who, I turned the sermon pages just like him. Do you remember? And he was just an important person in my life for 11 months when he decided that because I had landed on staff with him at that church in Lethbridge, he would put good time into my life. We named our youngest son, Micah Blake McCurdy, after Blake Anderson. God bless him. Most of all, I think, what we can learn from this example of Jesus is the value of friendship and focus. The value of connecting with people who are important to us and then devoting good time to their lives, of focusing in on them and their ministry, their work, their growth, their discipleship. I mean, parents obviously have a big responsibility for this. But too often we neglect our big responsibilities and not spend enough time with our kids and not focus enough on what God is hoping for them, what they need to know about Jesus. It's important for us, I think, within the church, not only, for one thing, not to develop cliques. To be open to the crowds, to be willing to embarrass ourselves and say, I've talked to you and seen you around for ages, but I don't remember your name. That happened to me awkwardly just before church. But it's important, I think, for us to go beyond that, to develop a group that we can grow with, that we can go beyond the pleasantries and beyond the ordinary, how's the weather, how's your day kind of things. We need to focus in on some who will be promising and with whom we can grow and learn. I think that also, just before I come to a conclusion, that also works both ways. Not only do we have to think about how we can reach into the lives of others, but we also have to remind ourselves that we need to be willing to be reached by those mentors that would be important to us. To not say, I've come far enough already in my Christian life, I'm not willing to hear anything new. I'm not willing to be accountable to anybody else. I'm not willing to strike out in a God-shown direction because someone else leads me there. Instead, I need to be willing to mold my life in a way that I'm open to hearing God's word to me through that group that could help me. Well, Robert Coleman is almost 90 years old just now. He's still teaching part-time once in a while at Gordon Conwell Theological College near Boston. And when I checked a little while ago, his bio on his faculty webpage concludes with this. Coleman's personal interests include spending time with his family, including his children and grandchildren, and keeping in touch with those he has discipled. Those whom Robert Coleman has discipled are the crowds by now. But he's still interested in keeping in touch. His children and grandchildren, on the other hand, are a finite quality, a finite number, and he's spending most of his life, I suspect, at age 89, pouring his life into theirs, still devoting his life to little groups of people who in turn will go on to make a big difference for God's kingdom. So I challenge you to do that. To be willing to be challenged, to be willing to be open to even the scary possibilities of talking to more people than you're comfortable with. But to devote most of your time to a small group of people who could help you to grow and whom you could help to grow in the Christian faith. For more specific, practical ways about how you could join such a group here at West End, just feel free to ask several of us. We'd be very glad to work that out.